My cousin offered me $5,000 for Grandpa's rusty shipping container. I said no. Inside were 40 barrels of vintage 1960s Scotch whiskey, sealed shut for almost 60 years. A London auction house called 2 weeks later, and what they told me changed everything. That container sat in a gravel yard on the edge of the Columbia River for decades. Rust ate through the paint. Weeds grew up around the wheels. Everybody in my family walked past it 1,000 times and saw junk. A dead man's leftover cargo. Something to haul to the scrapyard the moment the old man's funeral was over. My cousin saw dollar signs the second the will was read. $5,000 for the container, he said, cash in hand, done by Friday. He wanted it gone before anyone else in the family got curious about what was locked behind those steel doors. He wanted it gone before I had time to think. I did not sign. I stood in that yard with the smell of rust and river water in the air, and something in my gut told me to wait. Grandpa never did anything without a reason, not once in his whole life. A man does not drag a 40-foot steel container across an ocean and guard it like a vault for 60 years because it holds nothing. 3 days later, I cut the lock myself, and I found rows of oak barrels, stamped with markings from a distillery that closed its doors before I was even born. Names burned into the wood, dates that made my hands shake when I read them. I had no idea what I was looking at. I took photographs. I sent them to a whiskey expert in Scotland because a friend told me to try. He called me back within an hour, and his voice sounded different than it did in his email. Careful, almost scared to say the words out loud. Then Ashcombe and Vane, one of the oldest auction houses in London, called my phone directly. A woman with a clipped English accent asked me to sit down before she said another word. What came next tore my family apart, put a lawyer's forged signature under a microscope, and forced me to fight the people I grew up loving. Business rivals circled. My own blood turned against me. And through all of it, I learned exactly what my grandfather had been protecting, and exactly why he never told a soul. This is my story. Stick with me to the end, because the twist waiting at that London auction house is bigger than money. It is about what a dying man does when he no longer trusts his own family to do the right thing. Before we get into it, hit that like button, share this with someone who loves a good family story, drop a comment when you get to the part that shocks you, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and I am 44 years old. I grew up in Astoria, Oregon, a small fishing town where the Columbia River meets the Pacific, and the fog sits on the water almost every morning of the year. My mother worked the line at a seafood cannery for 18 years. My father left when I was 6, and I stopped waiting for him to come back somewhere around age 9. Money was tight in our house the way it is tight for a lot of families in small coastal towns. We counted coins for the laundromat. We ate a lot of rice and canned fish that my mother brought home from work at a discount. The one steady thing in my childhood was my grandfather, Walter Whitfield. He came to America from a small village near Speyside, Scotland, back in 1958, with a suitcase and enough English to get by on the docks. He worked his way up from loading crates at the port of Astoria to running his own small import and export outfit by the time I was born. Whitfield Trading, the sign said, painted by his own hand on a warehouse door that always smelled like salt water and pine tar. Grandpa Walter was not a warm man in the way people talk about warm grandfathers in movies. He did not hug much. He did not say "I love you" often, but he showed up. Every Sunday, without fail, he picked me up in his old blue pickup truck and took me down to the docks. He taught me how to read a bill of lading before I could do long division. He taught me how a container ship works, how cargo gets tracked from one side of the world to the other, and how a man's word on a handshake used to mean more than any contract. He also taught me to notice things other people missed. He would point at a crate on a dock and ask me what was inside before we opened it. Weight of the box, markings on the wood, country of origin stamped in the corner. He turned it into a game, but looking back, I think he was training me for something. I just did not know what yet. School was hard for me, not because I struggled with the material, but because we did not have the clothes or the shoes the other kids had. Kids can be cruel about things like that. I remember one winter I wore the same jacket for 3 years straight, patched at the elbows by my mother's shaking hands after a double shift. I learned early to keep my head down and work harder than everyone else in the room, because that was the only advantage I had. By the time I turned 14, Grandpa Walter started acting strange. Not sick strange, secretive strange. He would disappear for a week at a time, telling my mother he had business in Portland or Seattle. He came home quieter each time, like something weighed on him that he refused to hand off to anyone else. One night I caught him standing alone in his warehouse office, staring at a folded letter with foreign stamps on the envelope. When he saw me in the doorway, he folded it fast and put it in a drawer he always kept locked. I asked him once what was in that drawer. He looked at me for a long moment, longer than felt normal, and said, "Someday, Daniel, someday you'll understand, and I hope by then you're a man who deserves to." I did not understand what he meant. I was 14. I wanted a bike, not riddles. Money stayed scarce those years. My mother sometimes worked doubles at the cannery just so we could afford new shoes before the school year started. And I remember one Christmas when Grandpa Walter showed up at our door with a small tree strapped to the roof of his truck, because he noticed we did not have one that year, and said nothing about it to my mother, just handed her the tree like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. He never made a show of helping us. He just showed up when it counted, over and over, until I stopped noticing it as anything unusual and started expecting it as simply who he was. I remember one Sunday down at the docks when I was maybe 12, watching him negotiate a shipping rate with a stubborn cannery owner who kept trying to talk him down on price. Grandpa never raised his voice once. He just repeated the same number, calm and steady, until the other man finally gave in out of sheer exhaustion. On the drive home, I asked him why he did not just accept the lower offer to get the deal done faster. "A man who folds on his word the first time someone pushes back," he said, eyes on the road, "will fold every time after that too. You hold your line, Daniel, or you don't have a line at all." I carried that lesson with me longer than I carried almost anything else he ever taught me. The following year, a rusted 40-foot shipping container showed up in the gravel lot behind Grandpa's warehouse. 2 men delivered it on a flatbed truck late on a Tuesday night, and Grandpa paid them in cash out of an envelope he pulled from his coat pocket. He never explained where it came from. He locked it with a heavy chain and a padlock the size of my fist, and he told everyone in the family, in a tone that did not invite questions, that nobody was to touch it, ever. My Aunt Linda, Grandpa's youngest daughter, rolled her eyes about it for years. She called it his junk box at every family dinner. My cousin Marcus, her son, used to climb on top of it when we were kids, daring me to pick the lock with him. I never did. Something about the way Grandpa guarded that container kept me honest, even as a reckless teenager who broke plenty of other rules. Marcus and I were close once, closer than most cousins manage to stay once adulthood pulls people in different directions. We spent whole summers fishing off the pier together, trading comic books, sneaking into the drive-in theater through a gap in the back fence. Aunt Linda married young and divorced twice by the time Marcus turned 10, and money in her house came and went in unpredictable waves depending on which boyfriend was paying rent that particular year. Grandpa helped her quietly too, the same way he helped my mother, though Linda never seemed to carry the same gratitude for it that my mother did. She always acted like the help was owed to her rather than given freely, and looking back now, I think that difference in how each of them received Grandpa's generosity shaped the men their sons eventually became. Life kept moving. I graduated high school with decent grades and no money for college, so I worked the docks alongside Grandpa for 2 years, learning the family trade the hard way, hauling crates and learning freight contracts from the ground up. Eventually, I saved enough to attend a community college for a business degree, working nights the entire time. My mother cried the day I graduated, the first person in our family to walk across a stage with a diploma in hand. Grandpa Walter got sick when I was 26. Heart trouble, the kind that sneaks up slow and then takes everything fast. I sat with him in the hospital more nights than I can count, and in those quiet hours, he started talking more than he ever had in my whole childhood. He told me stories about Scotland, about his father who worked at a small distillery near a village called Invergarney, tucked into the hills of Speyside. About the year that distillery shut its doors for good, in 1967, victim of a bad economy and a greedy new owner who drained the company dry. They were going to dump the stock, he told me one night, his voice thin but his eyes sharp. 40 barrels, some of the finest whiskey ever laid down in a cask, and the new owner wanted to sell the copper stills for scrap and pour the rest down the drain. I could not let that happen, Daniel. My father worked that floor for 30 years. I asked him what he did. He just smiled, a tired, satisfied kind of smile, and said, "I saved what I could." I pressed him for more details on one of our last nights together, sitting beside his hospital bed while machines beeped steadily in the background. I asked him why he never sold whatever he had saved, especially during the years money was tight for our family. He turned his head toward the window and was quiet for so long I thought he had drifted off to sleep. "Because it was never mine to sell," he finally said. "It belonged to the men who worked that floor beside my father. Every barrel carries their labor inside it. You don't cash in another man's work just because you're short on rent money, Daniel. I'd rather go without than do that to their memory." He paused, then added, quieter, "Besides, some things aren't meant to be sold at all. Some things are meant to be protected until the right hands are ready to carry them forward." I did not know then that he was talking about me. 3 weeks later, Grandpa Walter passed away in his sleep. He was 79 years old. The whole town of Astoria came out for his funeral, because a man who ran an honest business for 50 years earns that kind of respect in a small town. I stood at the front of the church, next to my mother, and I did not cry until the casket lowered, and then I could not stop. At the reading of his will 2 weeks later, the family gathered in a small law office downtown. Grandpa left the warehouse and the business equipment to my mother. He left his house to Aunt Linda. He left small amounts of cash to a handful of cousins and old friends from the docks. And then the lawyer read a single line that made the whole room go quiet. "The shipping container currently located on the warehouse property, and any and all contents therein, shall pass to my grandson, Daniel Whitfield, and to him alone." I felt every eye in that room turn toward me. Aunt Linda's jaw tightened. My cousin Marcus leaned forward in his chair like he had not heard correctly. Nobody said anything out loud that day, but I could feel the resentment settling into the room like fog rolling off the river. Whatever was in that container, Grandpa had made sure it belonged to me, and only me, and I had absolutely no idea why. The years right after Grandpa's funeral were some of the hardest of my life, and none of them had anything to do with a shipping container I mostly forgot about. I was 27, freshly married to a woman named Emily Carter, a nurse I met at the hospital during Grandpa's final weeks. She had a laugh that filled a room and a patience for me that I did not always deserve. We got married in a small ceremony at a park overlooking the river, with maybe 40 guests and a cake my mother baked herself because we could not afford a bakery order. It was simple, and it was enough. I decided I wanted to build something of my own instead of just running Grandpa's old warehouse operation. I had ideas about modernizing freight logistics for small Pacific Northwest businesses, cutting out the middlemen who charged small fishing outfits and family farms triple what the big corporations paid. I called it Whitfield Logistics, a nod to my grandfather, and I put every cent Emily and I had saved into leasing 2 used delivery trucks and renting a small office space above a hardware store in downtown Astoria. The first year nearly broke me. I underbid contracts to win clients, which meant working 18-hour days just to cover fuel and payroll for the one employee I could afford. I made mistakes. I signed a shipping contract with a company in Tacoma that turned out to be running fraudulent invoices, and it cost me almost $11,000 I did not have. I remember sitting in my truck outside the bank, staring at a rejection letter for a small business loan, wondering if I had made the worst decision of my life, dragging Emily into this with me. Emily never once told me to quit. She picked up extra shifts at the hospital to keep our lights on. She sat with me at our kitchen table late at night, going over spreadsheets with a calculator and a pot of coffee, helping me find every dollar I could shave off. There were nights we fought, ugly fights born out of exhaustion and fear, the kind where you say things you regret the second they leave your mouth. But we always found our way back to the same table the next morning, still working, still trying. I remember one fight in particular, maybe 8 months into that first brutal year, when I came home past midnight after a broken-down delivery truck stranded me 2 hours south of town. Emily had waited up, worried sick, and when I walked through the door covered in engine grease with nothing but bad news about the repair bill, something in both of us finally cracked. "We have 2 kids on the way in this life eventually, Daniel," she said, her voice shaking somewhere between anger and fear. "I need to know you're building something that can actually hold us up, not just chasing your grandfather's ghost down at those docks." I did not have a good answer for her that night. I just stood in our kitchen, exhausted and covered in grease, and told her the only thing I knew for certain, which was that I could not quit, not because of stubborn pride, but because quitting felt like proving every person who ever doubted a poor kid from Astoria right. She did not fully agree with me that night, and we went to bed still tense, still unresolved. But by morning she was back at the table with her calculator, working the numbers beside me without another word needed. That was Emily's way of forgiving me, and I learned over the years never to take it for granted. By year 3, Whitfield Logistics started to turn a real profit. I built relationships with small canneries and berry farms across 3 counties, offering fair rates and honest service in an industry that did not always reward honesty. I hired a second driver, then a dispatcher, then a small office staff. By year 5, I had 12 employees and a client list that stretched from Astoria all the way down to Newport. It was not a fortune, but it was mine, built with my own 2 hands, and it let Emily and I buy a modest house near the edge of town. Somewhere around year 4, our daughter Grace was born, followed 2 years later by our son Owen. Fatherhood changed the way I looked at the business entirely. I stopped thinking about growth for the sake of growth and started thinking about stability, about building something that could survive a bad year without collapsing, because now 2 small people depended on decisions I made at that kitchen table every night. Emily went part-time at the hospital for a few years to be home with the kids, which meant tighter money again for a while, but we managed it the same way we managed everything else, one careful choice at a time. There was a stretch during year 6 when a major client, a mid-sized cannery that accounted for nearly a third of my company's revenue, abruptly switched to a larger competitor offering rock-bottom rates I could never match. I remember sitting in my office that week, staring at a spreadsheet that showed exactly how many months we could survive on savings alone if I could not replace that revenue fast. I did not sleep much that month. I drove to every business up and down the coast I could think of, cold pitching owners who already had shipping arrangements, offering better service and a level of personal attention the big companies never bothered with. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt what I lost, client by client, handshake by handshake, exactly the way Grandpa taught me on those Sunday mornings at the docks. Through all of it, Grandpa's shipping container sat forgotten in the gravel lot behind my mother's warehouse, rusting a little more every winter. I checked on it maybe once a year, out of habit more than curiosity. The chain and padlock stayed exactly as Grandpa left them, I never had the time or the reason to wonder what was actually inside. That changed the year I turned 44, the same year my mother finally decided to sell the old warehouse property. She was tired of maintaining it, and with the business having outgrown the space years earlier, it made sense to let it go. That decision brought the whole family back together for the first time in years, standing in that same gravel lot, arguing about what to do with everything left behind. My cousin Marcus showed up on a Saturday morning I will never forget, driving a truck that was nicer than anything he could actually afford, wearing a leather jacket and sunglasses, even though the sky was gray and flat the way it always is in Astoria. Marcus had spent the last decade bouncing between failed business ventures, always chasing the next big score, always a little too smooth for my comfort. He and Aunt Linda had never quite let go of the resentment from that will reading, and Marcus made that clear the moment he stepped out of his truck. "I'll take that thing off your hands," he said, jerking his thumb toward the container like he was doing me a favor. $5,000 cash. I know a guy who scraps steel containers. It's rusted through anyway. You're basically getting free money for a piece of junk Grandpa never should have left you in the first place. Something about the way he said, "in the first place," put a knot in my stomach. He had clearly been thinking about this for a long time. I asked him why he wanted a rusted container so badly if it was worthless scrap metal, and he stumbled over his answer just enough for me to notice. He mentioned something about wanting to flip it for parts. He would not look me in the eye when he said it. I told him I needed a few days to think about it. He pushed harder than I expected, offering to bump the number to 6,000 if I signed something that afternoon. The urgency in his voice was the loudest warning sign of all. Grandpa spent his whole life teaching me to read people the way he read cargo manifests, and everything about Marcus that morning read wrong. "Come on, Danny," he said, using the childhood nickname he had not called me in 15 years like he thought it might soften me up. "You've got the whole business now. You don't need some rusted eyesore taking up space. Let me handle it. I could use the win, honestly. Things haven't been easy for me." I told him I understood that and I meant it. But something about a grown man showing up in a leather jacket, driving a truck he could not afford, suddenly desperate to haul away a piece of junk metal, did not add up in my head no matter how many times I turned it over. I drove home that night and told Emily the whole story over dinner. She set down her fork and looked at me the way she does when she already knows what I am about to say before I say it. "You're not selling it," she said. "It was not a question." "I'm not selling it," I agreed. 3 days later, on a foggy Tuesday morning, I drove out to the warehouse lot alone with a bolt cutter from my own garage. I stood in front of that container for a long moment before I cut the chain, remembering Grandpa's voice from all those years ago in his office. "Someday, Daniel, someday you'll understand." The chain fell to the gravel with a heavy clank. I pulled the rusted latch and forced the double doors open, metal screaming against metal after 60 years sealed shut. Cold, musty air rolled out to meet me, carrying a smell I did not expect. Not mildew, not rust. Something warm underneath the cold, sweet and smoky at the same time, like a campfire burning somewhere far away. I stepped inside with my phone flashlight cutting through the dark, and there they were, rows of wooden barrels, 5 across and 8 deep, resting on iron cradles that Grandpa must have welded himself. 40 barrels total, exactly as I would later count them, each one stamped with faded lettering burned into the oak. I crouched down and wiped the dust off the nearest one with my sleeve. INVERGARNIE Distillery, cask number 219, distilled 1962. My hands started shaking before my brain even caught up to what I was looking at. I moved down the row, reading more stamps. 1961, 1963, 1964, all from the same distillery, all sealed with wax and iron hoops that had somehow held for over half a century inside a steel box that Grandpa guarded like it held gold. I called my whiskey collector friend, a guy named Pete I knew from a trade association meeting years earlier, and sent him photos with hands that would not stop trembling. He called me back within the hour, and I could hear him packing on the other end of the line. "Daniel," he said, his voice tight and careful, "do you have any idea what Invergarny whiskey from that era is worth? That distillery closed in 1967. It never reopened. There are maybe a handful of confirmed casks left in the entire world. Collectors call whiskey like this a ghost distillery pour. If those barrels are real, and if that whiskey is still good after all these years, you are sitting on one of the rarest finds in the history of Scotch whiskey." I sat down right there on the gravel, next to a container my family had called junk for 30 years, and I could not say a single word. If you have ever had a moment where your whole world tilted sideways in an instant, you already know exactly how I felt standing in that lot. Drop a comment below if you have ever discovered something in your own family that nobody expected, because this story is just getting started, and I promise you it gets more complicated from here. If you have not subscribed yet, now is the time, because you do not want to miss what happened when London found out. Pete connected me with an independent whiskey authenticator based out of Seattle, a soft-spoken man named Robert Ashworth who had spent 30 years verifying rare spirits for private collectors. He drove up to Astoria the following weekend and spent 4 hours in that gravel lot with a flashlight, a notebook, and a set of tools I had never seen before. He tested the wax seals. He measured the barrel staves. He photographed every stamp and every iron hoop from every angle. When he finally sat down with me in my kitchen, he set his notebook on the table and folded his hands like a doctor about to deliver news. "These are authentic," he said. "Invergarny Distillery closed in 1967 after a hostile takeover drained its assets. Company records show 40 casks unaccounted for at the time of closure, believed lost or destroyed. Every collector and historian I know has spent decades assuming those 40 barrels were dumped or sold off in pieces. As far as the whiskey world is concerned, they vanished." He looked at me and let that sentence hang in the air. "They did not vanish, Mr. Whitfield. Your grandfather shipped them across an ocean and hid them in plain sight for almost 60 years. Robert spent another hour walking me through what he called the provenance chain, the documented history that would need to hold up under scrutiny from serious collectors and auction specialists. He photographed the original shipping manifest Grandpa had kept folded inside that locked drawer in his office, a document my mother found while cleaning out his old files months after the funeral, and had simply stored away without realizing its significance. The manifest listed the cargo simply as distillery equipment and stock, personal property, dated October of 1967, stamped by a customs office in Liverpool that had long since closed. Robert said that single piece of paper, brittle and yellowed with age, might end up being worth more to authenticators than anything else in the container, because it proved beyond doubt exactly when and how the barrels left Scotland. Robert explained that the whiskey world treats lost distillery stock the way art collectors treat a rediscovered painting. Rarity, age, and story all combine to drive value far beyond what any calculator could predict from age alone. He recommended I contact a specialist auction house immediately, both for a proper valuation and for security, because word travels fast in tight collector circles, and rare finds like this one attract attention from people with far less patience than a family lawyer. I reached out to Ashcombe and Vane, a London auction house with a 200-year history in rare spirits, wine, and whiskey sales. A woman named Charlotte Rays, their head of spirits acquisitions, called me back within a day of receiving my photographs and Robert's authentication report. Her voice on that first call was careful and measured, the voice of someone who had learned not to sound too excited on a phone line she could not fully trust yet. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "if these barrels are what your documentation suggests, we are looking at one of the most significant whiskey discoveries in the last 20 years. I would like to fly a team out to inspect them in person, and I would strongly advise you to secure that container immediately. News like this does not stay quiet." Charlotte was right, and the leak did not take long to find its source. Marcus showed up at my house 4 days later, and this time he did not bother with pleasantries. He stood on my porch, red-faced, demanding to know why I had not sold him the container like I promised. I told him I never promised anything, and I told him exactly what Pete and Robert had found inside. I watched his face shift from anger to something colder and more calculating in real time. "That's family property," he said. "Grandpa would have wanted it split fair between all of us." I reminded him, as gently as I could manage given the circumstances, that Grandpa's will named me and only me. Marcus's jaw tightened, and he left without another word, which should have worried me more than it did at the time. 2 weeks later, my mother's lawyer, a longtime family friend named Douglas Ferris, who had handled Whitfield legal matters for 30 years, called me with news that turned my stomach. Marcus had filed a claim in probate court, presenting a document he called a codicil, an amendment to Grandpa's original will, dated just 3 weeks before Grandpa passed away. The codicil claimed Grandpa changed his mind and wanted the shipping container's contents split equally among all his grandchildren, Marcus included. I had never heard Grandpa mention any such change. Neither had my mother. Neither had Douglas, who had drafted and filed Grandpa's actual will and would have been the natural person to handle any amendment. Something did not sit right about the whole thing, and it turned out my instincts were correct, though it would take months of legal work to prove it. Meanwhile, Charlotte Reyes and her team from Ashcombe and Vane completed their full inspection of the barrels, and the valuation numbers they delivered nearly stopped my heart. Given the age, the rarity, the confirmed provenance from a closed ghost distillery, and the growing global demand for historic Scotch whiskey among wealthy collectors in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, they estimated the 40 barrels could fetch between $6 and $9 million at a properly promoted international auction. Some individual rare casks, they explained, could sell for over $100,000 apiece to the right buyer. I sat with that number for a long time before I told Emily. When I finally did, she cried, and then she laughed, and then she cried again, holding onto me in our small kitchen the same way she had held onto me during our hardest years building the freight business from nothing. But money like that does not stay quiet, and it does not stay simple, especially not in a family already fractured by resentment and old wounds. Within a month, a man named Preston Cole, an executive from a mid-sized spirits conglomerate called Highland Crest Distilleries, contacted me directly, claiming he wanted to make a generous private offer to buy the barrels before they ever reached auction, avoiding what he called the unnecessary drama of a public sale. I turned him down. Charlotte had already warned me that private buyers sometimes lowball desperate sellers, and I was not desperate, not anymore. Preston Cole did not take the rejection well. His tone shifted from friendly to sharply professional in a single phone call, and he made a comment before hanging up that I did not fully understand until later. "You should be careful who you trust with something this valuable, Mr. Whitfield," he said, "family included." I hung up the phone that day feeling a chill I could not quite explain, and I mentioned the strange comment to Emily that night at dinner. She frowned and told me to trust my gut, the same way I had trusted it the morning I refused Marcus's $5,000. I wish I had listened more carefully to that unease, because within a month, the warning would prove to be far more literal than either of us imagined. 3 weeks after that call, someone broke into the storage facility where I had moved the barrels for safekeeping, a secure warehouse on the outskirts of Portland with cameras and an alarm system. Nothing was stolen, but 2 barrels had been tampered with, their wax seals partially broken, as if someone had tried to sample or damage the contents before being interrupted by a night security guard on his rounds. The security footage showed a man in a dark jacket and a baseball cap, face carefully turned from every camera angle, moving with the confidence of someone who had scouted the building beforehand. My blood ran cold watching that footage, because something about the way he moved through the warehouse felt familiar. He knew exactly which aisle held the barrels. He knew exactly where the blind camera spots were located. Only a handful of people had that information. My mother, Emily, Douglas Ferris, Charlotte Rays and her team in London. And Marcus, who I had foolishly mentioned the storage location to during a tense phone call 2 weeks earlier, back when I was still trying to keep peace in the family and hoping he would drop his ridiculous legal claim. I did not have proof yet, but I had a feeling settling in my chest that felt exactly like the fog rolling off the Columbia River on a cold morning, thick enough that I could barely see my own hand in front of my face, and heavy enough that I knew, deep down, something dark was coming for my family before this was over. Douglas Ferris hired a forensic document examiner named Karen Voss to analyze the codicil Marcus submitted to probate court. Her report landed on my kitchen table on a rainy Thursday afternoon, and it confirmed every suspicion I had been carrying since the day Marcus first mentioned it. The paper used for the supposed codicil was manufactured after Grandpa's death. The ink showed chemical properties consistent with a specific brand of pen that had only entered the market 2 years after Grandpa passed away. Even the signature, though a decent forgery to the untrained eye, showed subtle inconsistencies in pen pressure and letter spacing when compared against verified samples of Grandpa's actual handwriting from his final years, when arthritis had already begun changing the shape of his script. Marcus had forged the entire document. My cousin, the same boy I grew up climbing docks and chasing seagulls with, had fabricated legal paperwork to steal a portion of my inheritance. And worse, I now believed he had also broken into a secured warehouse and tampered with barrels worth millions of dollars. I confronted him directly before taking anything to the authorities, mostly because a part of me still hoped there was some explanation that did not end with my cousin as a criminal. We met at a diner on the edge of town, neutral ground, at Emily's suggestion, because she worried what might happen if I showed up at his house alone with the anger I was carrying. Marcus denied everything at first, sitting across the booth with his arms crossed and his jaw set tight. But when I laid Karen Voss's forensic report on the table between us, page by page, his composure started to crack. He admitted the codicil was fake. He admitted, in a low voice that barely rose above the diner's clattering dishes, that Preston Cole from Highland Crest Distilleries had approached him weeks earlier, offering him $100,000 if he could secure a legal claim to even a portion of the barrels, enough to force a private sale that would let Preston acquire the whiskey far below its true market value. He said it would be easy, Marcus told me, staring down at his coffee instead of my face. He said you'd probably just settle rather than deal with a lawsuit. I needed the money, Daniel. You don't know what it's like, watching you build this whole successful life while I've got nothing to show for mine. I felt something break inside me hearing that, not quite anger, more like grief for the cousin I thought I knew. I asked him directly about the break-in at the warehouse, and his face went pale in a way that told me everything before he even opened his mouth. He admitted Preston Cole had pushed him to get inside and damage a few barrels, hoping to create doubt about the whiskey's quality and drive down the auction estimate, giving Preston leverage to swoop in with a lowball private offer once the sale looked shaky. I walked out of that diner without finishing my coffee, and I drove straight to Douglas Ferris's office to hand over everything Marcus had confessed. The probate hearing 3 weeks later turned into something closer to a criminal proceeding once Karen Voss's forensic report and Marcus's own admissions entered the court record. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Patricia Nolan, who had clearly heard every kind of family dispute imaginable over her long career, did not hide her disappointment as she reviewed the evidence. Douglas called Robert Ashworth to the stand to testify about the authentication process and the original 1967 shipping manifest, establishing beyond any doubt that the barrels had belonged solely to Grandpa Walter since the year he brought them into the country. Karen Voss followed, walking the courtroom through her forensic analysis point by point, explaining in plain terms how the paper stock, the ink composition, and the inconsistent signature pressure all proved the codicil had been fabricated years after Grandpa's death. I watched several jurors in the gallery, brought in only as observers since this was a bench proceeding, shake their heads quietly as she spoke. Aunt Linda sat in the courtroom gallery through the entire hearing, her face growing paler with every piece of evidence read into the record. I had not spoken to her much since Marcus first showed up demanding the container, but I could see, watching her that day, that she had no idea what her son had actually done. When Judge Nolan formally dismissed Marcus's fraudulent claim and referred the forgery evidence to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges, Linda broke down crying in the gallery, and I felt my own chest tighten with a complicated mix of anger and pity I had not expected. Preston Cole's role in the scheme came out during a follow-up investigation. Once Marcus, facing real legal consequences, agreed to cooperate and provide records of his communications with the Highland Crest executive, Preston lost his position at the company within a month, and Highland Crest Distilleries issued a public statement distancing themselves entirely from his actions, though the damage to their reputation in the tight-knit whiskey collecting world lingered for years afterward. The legal battle strained my marriage more than I expected it to. Emily supported me through every hearing and every late night reviewing documents with Douglas, but the stress of months spent fighting my own family took a toll neither of us fully prepared for. There was one night, maybe 2 months into the proceedings, when we sat on opposite ends of our couch in near silence, both of us exhausted, both of us snapping at small things that had nothing to do with the real problem. I remember Emily finally breaking the silence, her voice tired but steady. "I didn't marry you for the money that might come out of this," she said. "I married you because you're the kind of man who cuts a lock on a rusted container instead of taking the easy $5,000. Do not let this fight turn you into someone who forgets that about himself." Her words stuck with me through every difficult hearing that followed. I made a conscious choice after that night to separate the man I wanted to be from the anger the whole situation kept feeding. I pursued the legal claim fully and fairly, but I refused to let it consume every conversation in my house. The final hearing arrived on a gray November morning, fog thick over the courthouse parking lot the way it always sits over Astoria this time of year. Judge Nolan reviewed the complete evidence one final time: the forensic report, Marcus's recorded confession, the warehouse security footage, and Preston Cole's own email records subpoenaed from Highland Crest. She ruled firmly and completely in my favor, confirming the original will stood exactly as written, with the container and its full contents belonging solely to me, exactly as Grandpa Walter had intended from the very beginning. Marcus was formally charged with forgery and criminal trespass 3 weeks later. He eventually pleaded to reduced charges, receiving probation and a mandate for restitution given his cooperation against Preston Cole. But the damage to our family relationship was not something any courtroom could repair. I have not spoken to him since that hearing, and honestly, I am not sure I ever will again. Sitting in that courthouse hallway after the ruling, watching the fog roll past the window while Emily held my hand tight enough to hurt, I finally let myself think about Grandpa again, and about that locked drawer in his old office, and about the words he said to me when I was 14 years old. "Someday, Daniel, someday you'll understand, and I hope by then you're a man who deserves to." I understood now. He was not just protecting 40 barrels of whiskey. He was testing which member of his family could be trusted to protect something valuable without letting greed rot them from the inside out. And he left that container, that responsibility, in my hands alone. If this part of the story hit you as hard as it hit me writing it down for the first time, take a second right now and hit that subscribe button, because the ending of this story is the part I am proudest to share. The auction took place the following spring, in a grand paneled room at Ashcombe and Vane's headquarters in London, though most of the bidding happened remotely through phone lines and online proxies from collectors around the world. Charlotte Rays invited me and Emily to attend in person, and standing in that room, watching bid numbers climb higher and higher on a digital board, while a room full of serious, quiet men and women in expensive suits raised paddles for whiskey my own grandfather had carried across an ocean in the back of a cargo ship, felt like standing inside a dream I had not earned the right to have. The final total, once every barrel and individual rare cask sold, came to just over $8.2 million. I sat in that London auction room with Emily's hand gripping mine so tight I lost feeling in my fingers, and I thought about my mother working the cannery line for 18 years, and my patched jacket from 3 winters in a row, and Grandpa's careful, quiet hands teaching a poor kid from Astoria how to read a shipping manifest before he could do long division. I did not spend the money carelessly. I paid off every debt Whitfield Logistics had carried since its earliest struggling years. I bought my mother a modest, comfortable home closer to Emily and me, something she deserved after decades of hard, honest work with almost nothing to show for it beyond her own dignity. I set aside a trust fund for our 2 children, a boy and a girl who barely understood what all the fuss was about beyond noticing their parents suddenly smiling more. I also did something I know surprised a lot of people who heard this story secondhand. I used a significant portion of the money to expand Whitfield Logistics, building it into a proper regional freight and import company. And I created a small division specifically dedicated to helping other small Pacific Northwest businesses navigate international shipping and customs. The exact kind of support that would have saved my grandfather years of struggle when he first arrived from Scotland with nothing but a suitcase and a willingness to work. I reached out to a distillery historian in Speyside and helped fund a small permanent exhibit honoring the workers of Invergarney Distillery, including my great-grandfather, who spent 30 years on that production floor before the company folded. I traveled there myself with Emily, walking the same hills Grandpa Walter once described to me from his hospital bed, and I stood on the exact spot where the old distillery buildings once stood before they were eventually torn down. I brought a single bottle back with me, one small allocation I kept out of the auction, and I have never once opened it. It sits on a shelf in my home office, a reminder of exactly where I came from and exactly what one man's quiet integrity can protect across 60 years and thousands of miles. Aunt Linda and I slowly rebuilt something resembling a relationship over the following 2 years, though it took real time and real effort on both sides. She never once made another claim on the money, and eventually she admitted to me, over coffee at her kitchen table on a rainy afternoon, that she had suspected for years Marcus was capable of exactly the kind of scheme that finally came out in court. She simply never wanted to believe it about her own son. I understood that more than she probably realized. Family loyalty runs deep, even when it should not. Whitfield Logistics now employs over 60 people across 3 states, and every single one of them knows the story of the rusted shipping container. Because I tell it to every new hire during their first week, not to brag about the money. I tell it because I want every person who works for me to understand the values my grandfather actually cared about: patience, integrity, protecting what matters even when nobody else understands why it matters yet. My mother, now retired and finally free of the cannery line that took 18 years of her life, spends most of her afternoons in the garden of the home I bought her, and every time I visit, she reminds me to call Grandpa's whiskey what it truly was in her eyes. Not a fortune, a promise kept. She says it every single time, like a small prayer she never gets tired of repeating, and I have stopped correcting her or moving the conversation along because I think she is right. Emily and I are still married, 17 years and counting, And if anything, everything our family went through brought us closer rather than pulling us apart. She still keeps a framed photo on her nightstand of the two of us standing in that gravel lot the day I finally cut the lock, both of us covered in rust dust and grinning like fools who had no idea our whole lives were about to change. I think about Grandpa Walter almost every single day. I think about a young man leaving everything he knew behind in Scotland, working docks in a foreign country, and somehow finding a way to save something precious that everyone else had already written off as lost. I think about the quiet, patient decades he spent guarding that container, trusting that someday the right person would open it for the right reasons. I like to believe I became that person, not because of the money, though I would be lying if I said the money did not change my family's life in real, meaningful ways. I believe it because I chose patience over a quick payout the day Marcus offered me $5,000 in that gravel lot. I chose to trust my grandfather's judgment even when I did not understand it yet. That, more than any auction total, feels like the real inheritance he left me. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this entire story. It means more to me than you probably know that you spent this time listening to my family's journey. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family, your own grandparents, or the quiet sacrifices people make that we sometimes never fully understand until years later, please leave a comment below and share what stood out to you the most. I read every single one, and I love hearing which parts of these stories connect with your own lives. If you are new here, welcome, and please consider subscribing so you never miss the next deeply personal story we bring to this channel. There are more stories coming, stories about family, about second chances, about the things people choose to protect when nobody else is watching. I will see you in the next one.